Have you ever wondered about ancient civilizations, about lost continents, or about Atlantis? What is it about the legends and tales of these ancient yet advanced men of old that has enticed and intrigued our intellect? Could all of the UFO sightings around the world, the strange overnight appearing crop circles, things like this be connected with these lost worlds? And what about the Devil's Triangle, the Bermuda Triangle, and the strange happenings that have occurred there, the disappearances of planes and ships, the finding of underground pyramids, underwater pyramids, buildings, things like that? So what I propose to do in this series, with God's guidance and some unorthodox research and postulations, will be to prove to you that Atlantis existed, that the Greek and Phoenician gods and goddesses are just delusionary tales of this once existing kingdom, that all the lands and the peoples around the Atlantic Ocean have similar origins in their languages and customs, that physically the lands surrounding the ancient civilization all have common traits and features. And even now you can find remnants and traces of this lost civilization. To top it off, I will show you that God would have us learn about these ancient worlds, and that when we open up our minds to truth and throw out the traditions that make void God's word, we can know about these strange and wonderful things, learn about ancient and advanced civilizations, and all the while increasing our faith in God and in His Son, Jesus Christ, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. To give a basis right now for understanding the legends and stories of Atlantis, what we need to do is take a look at the original text concerning this fabled land. The story that we have was written by Plato. Plato lived about 400 years before Christ. He rewrites a story that he had learned from his ancestor by the name of Solon. Solon was a famous lawgiver of Athens some 200 years before Plato. Solon had visited Egypt and had learned of this mysterious island in the Atlantic through his talks with the wise men of Sais. Solon's conversation was with the most learned of the Egyptian priests. They talked about history and philosophy. He was very astute at conversing and pulling information from the minds of these priests. Plato, however, began writing this story late in his life and consequently died before it was finished. As a result, we have an amazing story of this intriguing island with its magnificent courts and enclosures and its grand entrances, yet we are left wanting to learn more because this story ends right in the middle of his discourse. So to begin our study, let's consider Solon's discourse. This discourse is lengthy. If you've heard it or read it before, you may want to skip to the next video because this particular one will be basically covering Plato's discourse, or Solon's discourse that Plato has written, our only actual ancient written text concerning this fabled land of Atlantis. And it begins. Critias is speaking. Critias. Then listen, Socrates, to a strange tale, which is, however, certainly true, as Solon, who is the wisest of the 7 sages, declared. He was a relative and a great friend of my great-grandfather, Dropidas, as he himself says in several of his poems. And Dropidas told Critias, my grandfather, who remembered, and told us that there were of old great and marvelous actions of the Athenians, which have passed into oblivion through time and the destruction of the human race. And one in particular, which was the greatest of them all, the recital of which will be a suitable testimony of our gratitude to you. Socrates speaking. Very good. And what is this ancient famous action of what Critias spoke? Not as a mere legend, but as a veritable action of the Athenian state which Solon recounted. Critias. I will tell an old story which I heard from an aged man, for Critias was, as he said, at that time nearly 90 years of age, and I was about 10 years of age. That's Plato. Now the day was the day that the Apaturia, which is called the registration of youth, at which, according to custom, our parents gave prizes for recitations, and the poems of several poets were recited by us boys, and many of us sung the poems of Solon, which were new at the time. One of our tribe, either because this was his real opinion or because he thought that it would please Critias, said that, in his judgment, Solon was not only the wisest of men, but the noblest of poets. The old man, I well remember, brightened up at this, and said, smiling, "Yes, Amenander, if Solon had only, like other poets, made poetry the business of his life, and had completed the tale which he brought with him from Egypt, and had not been compelled by reason of the factions and troubles which he had found stirring in this country when he came home, to attend other matters, in my opinion, he would have been as famous as Homer, Hesiod, or any poet." "And what was that poem about, Critias?" said the person who addressed him. "About the greatest action which the Athenians ever did, and which ought to have been most famous, but which, through the lapse of time and the destruction of the actors, has not come down to us." "Tell us," said the other, "the whole story, and how and from whom Solon heard this veritable tradition." He replied, "At the head of the Egyptian delta, where the Nile River divides, there is a certain district which is called the district of Sais. And the great city of the district is also called Sais, and is the city from which Amasis, the king, was sprung. And the citizens have a deity who is their foundress. She is called in the Egyptian tongue Neith, which is asserted by them to be the same whom the Hellenes called Athene or Athena. Now the citizens of this city are great lovers of the Athenians, and say that they are in some way related to them. Thither came Solon, who was received by them with great honor, and he asked the priests, who were the most skillful in such matters, about antiquity, and made the discovery that neither he nor any other Hellene knew anything worth mentioning about the times of old. On one occasion, when he was drawing them to speak of antiquity, he began to tell them about the most ancient things in our part of the world, about Pharonius, who was called the first, and about Niobe, and after the deluge, to tell of the lives of the Deucalion and the Pyrrha. And he traced the genealogy of their descendants, and attempted to reckon how many years old were the events of which he was speaking, and to give the dates. Thereupon one of the priests, who was of very great age, said, "O Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are but children, and there is never an old man who is a Hellene." Solon, hearing this, said, "What do you mean?" "I mean to say," he replied, "that in mind you are all young. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age. And I will tell you the reason of this. There have been, and there will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. There is a story which even you have preserved, that once upon a time Phaethon, the son of Helios, having yoked the steeds of his father's chariot because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burned up all that was upon the earth, and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt. Now this has the form of a myth, but really signifies a declination of the bodies moving around the earth and in the heavens, and a great conflagration of things upon the earth reoccurring at long intervals of time. When this happens, those who live upon the mountains in dry and lofty places are more liable to destruction than those who dwell by the rivers or on the seashore. And from this calamity, the Nile, who is our never-failing Savior, saves us and delivers us. When, on the other hand, the gods purge the earth with a deluge of water, Among you herdsmen and shepherds on the mountains are the survivors, whereas those of you who live in the cities are carried by the rivers into the sea. But in this country, neither at that time nor at any other does the water come from above on the fields, having always a tendency to come up from below, for which reason the things preserved here are said to be the oldest. The fact is that wherever the extremity of winter frost or of summer sun does not prevent, the human race is always increasing at times, and at other times diminishing in numbers. And whatever happened, either in your country or in ours, or in any other region of which we are informed, if any action which is noble or great, or in any other way remarkable has taken place, all that has been written down of old and is preserved in our temples. Whereas you and other nations are just being provided with letters and the other things which the states require. And then, at the usual period, the stream from heaven descends like a pestilence and leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education. And thus you have to begin all over again as children, and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either among us or among yourselves. As for those genealogies of yours which you have recounted to us, Solon, they are no better than the tales of children. For in the first place you remember one deluge only, whereas there were many of them. And in the next place you do not know that there dwelt in your land the fairest and noblest race of men which ever lived, of whom you and your city are but a seed or remnant. And this was unknown to you, because for many generations the survivors of that great destruction died and made no sign. For there was a time, Solon, before that great deluge of all, when the city which is now Athens was first in war, and was preeminent for the excellence of her laws, and is said to have performed the noblest deeds, and to have had the fairest constitution of any of which tradition tells under the face of heaven. Solon marveled at this, and earnestly requested the priest to inform him exactly and in order about these former citizens. You are welcome to hear about them, Solon, said the priest, both for your own sake and for that of the city, and above all for the sake of the goddesses, who is the goddess who is the common patron and protector and educator of both our cities. She founded your city 1,000 years before ours, receiving from the earth Hephaestus, the seed of your race, and then she founded ours, the constitution of which is set down in our sacred registers as 8,000 years old, as touching the citizens of 9,000 years ago. I will briefly inform you of their laws and of their noblest of their actions, and the exact particulars of the whole we will hereafter go through at our leisure in the sacred registers themselves. If you compare these very laws with your own, you will find that many of ours are the counterpart of yours, as they were in the olden time. In the first place, there is a caste of priests, which is separated from all the others. Next, there are the artificers, who exercise their several crafts by themselves, and without admixture of any other. And also there is a class of shepherds, and that of hunters, as well as that of husbandmen. And you will observe, too, that the warriors in Egypt are separated from all other classes, and are commanded by law only to engage in war. Moreover, the weapons with which they are equipped are shields and spears, and this the goddess taught first among you, and then in the Asiatic countries, and we among the Asiatics first adopted. Then as to wisdom, do you observe what care the law took from the very first, searching out and comprehending the whole order of things down to prophecy and medicine, the latter with a view to health? And out of these divine elements, drawing what was needful for human life, and adding every sort of knowledge which was connected to them, all this order and arrangement the goddess first imparted to you when establishing your city, and she chose the spot of earth in which you were born, because she saw that the happy temperament of the seasons in that land would produce the wisest of men. Wherefore the goddess, who was a lover of both war and of wisdom, selected and first of all settled that spot which was the most likely to produce men likest herself. And there you dwelt, having such laws as these and still better ones, and excelled all mankind in all virtue, as become the children and disciples of the gods. Many great and wonderful deeds are recorded of your state in our histories, but one of them exceeds all the rest in greatness and valor. For these histories tell of a mighty power which was progressing wantonly against the whole of the earth and Asia, and to which your city put an end. This power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean, for in those days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits of which you call the columns of Hercules. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together, and was the way to the other islands, and from the island you might pass through the whole of the opposite continent which surrounded the true ocean. For the sea, which is within the straits of Hercules, is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance. But that other is a real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a continent. Now, in the island of Atlantis there was a great and wonderful empire, which had rule over the whole island and several others, as well as our parts of the continent. And besides these, they subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Hercules as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. The vast power thus gathered into one endeavored to subdue at one blow our country and yours, and the whole of the land which was within the straits, and then Solon your country shone forth in excellence of her virtue and strength among all mankind. For she was the first in courage and military skill, and was the leader of the Hellenes. And when all the rest fell off from her, being compelled to stand alone, after having undergone the very extremity of danger, she defeated and triumphed over the invaders, and preserved from slavery those who were not yet subjected, and freely liberated all the others who dwelt within the limits of Heracles. But afterwards, and there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of rain, all of your warlike men in a body sunk into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared, and was sunk beneath the sea. And that is the reason why the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is such a quantity of shallow mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island. But in addition to the gods whom you have mentioned, I would specially invoke Mnemosyne, for all the important part of what I have to tell is dependent on her favor, and I can recollect and recite enough of what was said by the priests and brought hither by Solon. I doubt not that I shall satisfy the requirements of this theater. To that task, then, I will at once address myself. Let me begin by observing, first of all, that 9,000 was the sum of years which had elapsed since the war which was said to have taken place between all them who dwelt outside the pillars of Heracles or Hercules, and those who dwelt within them. This war I am now to describe. Of the combatants on one side of the city of Athens was reported to have been the ruler, and to have directed the contest. The combatants on the other side were led by the kings of the islands of Atlantis, which, as I was saying, once had an extent greater than that of Libya and Asia, and when afterwards sunk by an earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to the ocean. The progress of the history will unfold the various tribes of barbarians and the Hellenes which then existed, as they successively appear on the scene, but I must begin by describing first of all the Athenians as they were in that day, and their enemies who fought with them, and I shall have to tell the power and the form of government of both of them. Let us give precedence to Athens. Many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years, for that is the number of years which have elapsed since the time of which I am speaking. And in all the ages and changes of things, there has never been any settlement of the earth flowing down from the mountains, as in other places which is worth speaking of. It has always been carried round in a circle and disappeared in the depths below. The consequence is that, in comparison of what then was, there are remaining only small islets, only the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called, all of the richer and softer parts of the soil having fallen away, and the mere skeleton of the country being left. And next, if I have not forgotten what I have heard when I was a child, I will impart to you the character and origin of their adversaries. For friends should not keep their stories to themselves, but have them in common. Yet before proceeding farther in the narrative, I ought to warn you that you must not be surprised if you should hear Hellenic names given to foreigners. I will tell you the reason for this. Solon, who was intending to use the tale for his poem, made an investigation into the meaning of the names and found out the early Egyptians, in writing them down, had translated them into their own language, and he recovered the meaning of the several names and retranslated them and copied them out again in our language. My great-grandfather, Dropidas, had the original writing, which is still in my possession, and was carefully studied by me when I was a child. Therefore, if you hear names such as are used in this country, you must not be surprised, for I have told you the reason of them. The tale, which was of great length, began as follows. I have before remarked in speaking of the allotments of the gods that they distributed the whole earth into portions differing in extent, and had made themselves temples and sacrifices. And Poseidon, receiving for his lot the island of Atlantis, begat children by a mortal woman, and settled them in a part of the island which I will proceed to describe. On the side towards the sea, and in the center of the whole island, there was a plain, which is said to have been the fairest of all plains, and very fertile. Near the plain again was also in the center of the island, at a distance of about 50 stadia, there was a mountain, not very high on any side. In this mountain there dwelt one of the earth-born primeval men of that country, whose name was Evenor. And he had a wife named Leucippe, and they had an only daughter, whose name was Cleito. The maiden was growing up to womanhood when her father and mother died. Poseidon fell in love with her and had intercourse with her, and, breaking the ground, enclosed the hill in which she dwelt all around, making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which he turned as with a lave out of the center of the island, equidistant in every way, so that no man could get to the island, for ships and voyages were not heard of. He himself, as he was a god, found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the center island, bringing 2 streams of water under the earth, which he caused to ascend as springs, one of warm water and the other of cold, and making every variety of food to spring up abundantly in the earth. He also begat and brought up 5 pairs of male children, dividing the island of Atlantis into 10 portions. He gave to the firstborn of the eldest pair of his mother's dwelling and the surrounding allotment, which was the largest and the best, and made him king over the rest. The others he made princes, and gave them rule over many men and a large territory, and he named them all. The eldest, who was king, he named Atlas. And from him the whole island and the ocean received the name of Atlantic. To his twin brother, who was born after him, and obtained as his lot the extremity of the island toward the Pillars of Hercules, as far as the country which is still called the region of the Gades in that part of the world, he gave the name which in the Hellenic language is Eumelus, in the language of the country which is named after him. Gadarius of the second pair of twins, he called one Gadarius. Of the second pair of twins, he called one Amphares and the other Evamon. To the third pair of twins, he gave the name Menesus to the elder, and Autochitlan to the one who followed him. Of the fourth pair of twins, he called the elder Elasippus and the younger Mestor. And the fifth pair he gave to the elder the name of Azais, and the younger Diaprepes. All these and their descendants were the inhabitants and rulers of diverse islands in the open sea, and also, as has already been said, they held sway in the other direction over the country within the pillars of as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia. Now Atlas had a numerous and honorable family, and his eldest branch always retained the kingdom, which the eldest son handed on to his eldest for many generations. And they had such an amount of wealth as was never before possessed by kings or potentates, and is not likely ever to be again, for they were furnished with everything which they could have, both in city and country. For because of the greatness of their empire, many things were brought to them from foreign countries, and the island itself provided much of what was required by them for the uses of life. In the first place, they dug out of the earth whatever was to be found there, mineral as well as metal, and that which is now only a name, and was then something more than a name, or a callium, was dug out of the earth in many parts of the island, and, with the exception of gold, was esteemed the most precious of metals among the men of those days. There was an abundance of wood for carpenter's work, and sufficient maintenance for tame and wild animals. Moreover, there were a great number of elephants in the land, and there was a provision for animals of every kind, both for those which live in lakes and marshes and rivers, and also for those which live in mountains and on plains, and therefore for the animal which is the largest and most voracious of them. Also whatever fragrant things there are on the earth, whether roots or herbage or woods, or distilling drops of flowers or fruits, grew and thrived in that land. And again, they cultivated fruit of the earth, both the dry edible fruit and other species of food, which we call by the general name of legumes, beans, and the fruits having a hard rind, affording drinks and meats and ointments, the good store of chestnuts and the like, which may be used to play with, and are fruits which spoil with keeping, and the pleasant kinds of dessert which console us after dinner, when we are full and tired of eating. All of these that sacred island, lying beneath the sun, brought forth fair and wondrous in infinite abundance. All these things they received from the earth, and they employed themselves in constructing their temples and palaces and harbors and docks. And they arranged the whole country in the following manner. First of all, they bridged over the zones of sea which surrounded the ancient metropolis, and made a passage into and out of the royal palace. And then they began to build the palace in the habitation of the god and of their ancestors. This they continued to ornament, and in successive generations, every king surpassing the one who came before him to the utmost of his power, until they made the building a marvel to behold for size and beauty. And beginning from the sea, they dug a canal 300 feet in width and 100 feet in depth, and 50 stadia in length, which they carried through to the outermost zone, making a passage from the sea up to this, which became a harbor, and leaving an opening sufficient to enable the largest vessels to find ingress. Moreover, they divided the zones of land which parted the zones of sea, constructing bridges of such a width as would leave a passage for a single trireme to pass out of one into another, and roofed them over. And there was a way underneath for the ships, for the banks of the zones were raised considerably above the water. Now the largest of the zones into which a passage was cut from the sea was 3 stadia in breadth, and the zone of land which came next to of equal breadth. But the next two, as well as the zone of water as of land, were 2 stadia, and the one which surrounded the central island was a stadium only in width. The island in which the palace was situated had a diameter of 5 stadia. This, and the zones and the bridge, which was the 6th part of a stadium in width, they surrounded by a stone wall, on either side placing towers and gates on the bridges where the sea passed in. The stone which was used in the work they quarried from underneath the center island and from underneath the zones, on the outer as well as the inner side. One kind of stone was white, another black, and a third red. And as they quarried, They at the same time hollowed out docks double within, having roofs formed out of the native rock. Some of their buildings were simple, but in others they put together different stones, which they intermingled for the sake of ornament, to be a natural source of delight. The entire circuit of the wall, which went round the outermost one, they covered with a coating of brass, and the circuit of the next wall they coated with tin, and the third, which encompassed the citadel, flashed with the red light of orichalcum. The palaces in the interior of the citadel were constructed in this wise. In the center was a holy temple dedicated to Plato and Poseidon, which remained inaccessible, and was surrounded by an enclosure of gold. This was the spot in which they originally begat the race of 10 princes, and thither they annually brought the fruits of the earth in their season from all the 10 portions, and performed sacrifices to each of them. Here too was Poseidon's own temple, of a stadium in length and half a stadium in width, and of a proportionate height, having sort of a barbaric splendor. All the outside temple, with the exception of the pinnacles, they covered with silver, and pinnacles with gold. In the interior of the temple, the roof was ivory, adorned everywhere with gold and silver and orichalcum. All the other parts of the walls and pillars and floor they lined with orichalcum. In the temple they placed statues of gold, and there was the god himself standing in a chariot, the charioteer of 6 winged horses, and of such a size that he touched the roof of the building with his head. Around him there were 100 Nereids riding on dolphins, for such as was thought to be the number of them in that day. There were also in the interior of the temple other images, which had been dedicated by private individuals. And around the temple on the outside were placed statues of gold of all the 10 kings and of their wives. And there were many other great offerings, both of kings and of private individuals, coming from both from the city itself and the foreign cities over which they held sway. There was an altar too, in which in size and workmanship corresponded to the rest of the work, and there were palaces in like manner which answered to the greatness of the kingdom and the glory of the temple. In the next place, they used fountains both of cold and hot springs. These were very abundant, and both kinds wonderfully adapted to use by reason of the sweetness and excellence of their waters. They constructed buildings about them and planted suitable trees, also cisterns, some open to the heaven, others which they roofed over to be used in winter as warm baths. There were the king's baths and the baths of private persons, which were kept apart, also separate baths for women, and others again for horses and cattle. And to them they gave as much adornment as was suitable for them. The water which ran off they carried some to the grove of Poseidon, where were growing all manner of trees of wonderful height and beauty, owing to the excellence of the soil. The remainder was carried by aqueducts which passed over the bridges to the outer circles, and there were many temples built and dedicated to many gods. Also gardens and places of exercise, some for men and some set apart for horses, in both of the 2 islands formed by the zones. And in the center of the larger of the 2, there was a race course of a stadium in width and in length, allowed to extend all around the island for the horses to race in. And there were guard houses at intervals for the bodyguard, the more trusted of whom had their duties appointed to them in the lesser zone, which was nearer the Acropolis, while the most trusted of all had houses given them within the citadel and about the persons of the kings. The docks were full of triremes and naval stores, and all things were quite ready for use. Enough of the plan of the royal palace. Crossing the outer harbors, which were 3 in number, you would come to a wall which began at the sea and went all around. This was everywhere distant 50 stadia from the largest zone and harbor, and enclosed the whole, meeting at the mouth of the channel towards the sea. The entire area was densely crowded with habitations, and the canal and the largest of the harbors were full of vessels and merchants coming from all parts, who from their numbers kept up a multitudinous sound of human voices and din of all sorts night and day. I have repeated his descriptions of the city and the parts about the ancient palace nearly as he gave them, and now I must endeavor to describe the nature and arrangement of the rest of the country. The whole country was described as being very lofty and precipitous on the side of the sea, but the country immediately about and surrounding the city was a level plain, itself surrounded by mountains which descended towards the sea. It was smooth and even, but of an oblong shape, extending in one direction 3,000 stadia, and going up the country from the sea through the center of the island 2,000 stadia. The whole region of the island lies towards the south and is sheltered from the north. The surrounding mountains he celebrated for their number and size and beauty, in which they exceeded all that are now to be seen everywhere, having in them also many wealthy inhabited villages, and rivers and lakes and meadows, supplying food enough for every animal, wild or tame, and wood of various sorts, abundant for every kind of work. I will now describe the plain, which has been cultivated during many ages by many generations of kings. It was rectangular, and for the most part straight and oblong, and what it wanted of the straight line followed the line of the circular ditch. The depth and width and length of this ditch were incredible, and gave the impression that such a work, in addition to so many other works, could hardly have been wrought by the hand of a man. But I must say, what I have heard, it was excavated to a depth of 100 feet, and its breadth was a stadium everywhere. It was carried round the whole of the plain. It was 10,000 stadia in length. It received the streams which came down from the mountains, and winding round the plain, and touching the city at various points, was there led off into the sea. From above, likewise, straight canals of 100 feet in width were cut into the plain, and again led off into the ditch towards the sea. These canals were at intervals of 100 stadia, and by them they brought down the wood from the mountains to the city, and conveyed the fruits of the earth in ships, cutting transverse passages from one canal into the other, and to the city. Twice in a year they gathered the fruits of the earth, in winter having the benefit of the rains, and in summer introducing the water of the canals. As to the population, each of the lots of the plain had an appointed chief of men who were fit for military service, and the size of the lot was to be square of 10 stadia each way, and the total number of all the lots was 60,000. And of the inhabitants of the mountains and the rest of the country, there was also a vast multitude having leaders, to whom they were assigned according to their dwellings and villages. The leader was required to furnish for the war the 6th portion of a war chariot, so as to make up a total of 10,000 chariots, also 2 horses and riders upon them, and a light chariot without seat, accompanied by a fighting man on foot carrying a small shield, and having a charioteer mounted to guide the horses. Also, he was about to furnish 2 heavy armed men, 2 archers, 2 slingers, 3 stone shooters, and 3 javelin men, who were skirmishers, and 4 sailors, to make up a complement of 1,200 ships. Such was the order of war in the royal city. That of the other 9 governments was different in each of them, wearisome to narrate. As to offices and honors, the following was the arrangement from the first. Each of the 10 kings, in his own division and in his own city, had the absolute control of the citizens, and in many cases of the laws, punishing and slaying whomever he would. Now, the relations of their governments to one another were regulated by the injunctions of Poseidon, as the law had handed them down. These were inscribed by the first men on a column of orichalcum, which was situated in the middle of the island at the temple of Poseidon, whether the people were gathered together every 5th and 6th years alternately, thus giving equal honor to the odd and the even number. And when they were gathered together, they consulted about public affairs, and inquired if anyone had transgressed in anything, and passed judgment on him accordingly. And before they passed judgment, they gave their pledges to one another in this wise. There were bulls who had the range of the temple of Poseidon, and the 10 who were left alone in the temple, after they had offered prayers to the gods that they might take the sacrifices which were acceptable to them, hunted the bulls without weapons, but with staves and nooses. And the bull which they caught, they led up to the column. The victim was then struck on the head by them and slain over the sacred inscription. Now on the column, besides the law, there was inscribed an oath, invoking mighty curses on the disobedient. When therefore, after offering sacrifices according to their customs, they had burnt the limbs of the bull, they mingled a cup and cast in a clot of blood for each of them. The rest of the victims they took to the fire, after having made a purification of the column all around. Then they drew from the cup in golden vessels, and pouring a libation on the fire, they swore that they would judge according to the laws on the column, and would punish anyone who had previously transgressed, and that for the future they would not, if they could help, transgress any of the inscriptions, and would not command or obey any ruler who commanded them to act otherwise than according to the laws of their father Poseidon. This was the prayer which each of them offered up for himself and for his family, at the same time drinking and dedicating the vessel in the temple of the god. And after spending some necessary time at supper, when darkness came on and the fire about the sacrifice was cool, all of them put on most beautiful azure robes, and sitting on the ground at night near the embers of the sacrifices on which they had sworn, and extinguishing all fire about the temple, they received and gave judgment, if any of them had any accusation to bring against anyone. And when they had given judgment, at daybreak they wrote down their sentences on a golden tablet, and deposited them as memorials with their robes. There were many special laws which the several kings had inscribed about the temples, but the most important was the following: that they were not to take up arms against one another, and that they were all to come to the rescue if anyone in any city attempted to overthrow the royal house. Like their ancestors, they were to deliberate in common about war and other matters, giving to the supremacy to the family of Atlas, and the king was not to have the power of life and death over any of his kinsmen unless he had the assent of the majority of the 10 kings. Such was the vast power which the god settled in the lost island of Atlantis. And this he afterward directed against our land on the following pretext: as traditions tell, for many generations, as long as the divine nature lasted in them, they were obedient to the laws, and well affected towards the gods, who were their kinsmen, for they possessed true and in every way great spirits, practicing gentleness and wisdom in the various chances of life, and thinking lightly on them the possession of gold and other property, which seemed only a burden to them. Neither were they intoxicated by luxury, nor did wealth deprive them of their self-control, but they were sober, and saw clearly that all these goods are increased by virtual friendship with one another, and that excessive zeal for them and honor of them, the good of them is lost, and friendship perishes with them. By such reflections, and by the countenance in them of a divine nature, all that which we have described waxed and increased in them. But when this divine portion began to fade away in them, and became diluted too often, and with too much of the moral admixture, and the human nature got the upper hand, then they, being unable to bear their fortune, became unseemly. And to him who had an eye to see, they began to appear base, and had lost the fairest of their precious gifts. But to those who had no eye to see the true happiness, they still appeared glorious and blessed at every time that they were filled with unrighteousness, avarice, and power. Zeus, the god, perceiving that an honorable race was in a most wretched state, and wanting to inflict punishment on them that they might be chastened and improved, collected all the gods into his most holy habitation, which being placed in the center of the world, sees all things that partake of generations. And when he had called them together, he spake as follows. And there ends Plato's Discourse on Atlantis. I know it's kind of a long discourse, but the descriptions he's giving is an actual island in the middle of the Atlantic with actual peoples habiting it. And these things we'll discover as we go along. I've talked about the Micmac Indians in America having Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, as also the words are the same as what the Egyptians had. The knowledge didn't come from Egypt, but Egypt's knowledge and the Micmac's knowledge all came from Atlantis. The Dogon carry their beliefs with the regarding Sirius system. This ancient knowledge probably came from the Egyptians. However, it originally came from Atlantis. This was a great civilization, advanced, had vehicles in the air and in the sea, and it spoke about all over the world in Indian writings and texts, as well as some of the American Indian writings and texts. This place existed, people, and I'll continue on this subject. We'll talk about maybe Edgar Casey and what all he's got to say about Atlantis coming up. You all have a great day.